And when that happens, we can sometimes move out of the present and into the past with some rumination. We may jump into the future with worry and anxiety. And I want to give you a little tool, a grounding exercise that in that moment, in any moment, will help you just reconnect with the present and bring you right back to intentionally choose to be in this room with these people, with me, and present for the conversation that we're having right now. So if you'll join me, I invite you to join me. It's an exercise that we just call 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and we're just gonna engage our senses. So you don't have to talk to anybody, you don't have to share, you don't have to stand up and introduce yourself or anything like that. We're just gonna engage our senses. So we're gonna start with sight. I invite you to look around the room and just find 5 things in the room that you can see. You don't have to say them out loud, but be really descriptive with those in your mind. You're welcome to move around and turn in your chair. And then I want you to find 4 things that you can touch. You're welcome to reach out and touch those things, feel the texture. If it's on your neighbor, please ask for consent.
That's right.
And then 3 things that you can hear. Tune into 3 things that you can hear in the environment. Two things that you can smell. And finally, 1 thing that you can taste. It's really just an excuse to get one last sip of coffee. Thank you for doing that exercise with me. Again, I invite you to just take that with you. The great thing about that is you can do that with a group of people. You can do it on your own. You can do it silently. You can do it at any time when you feel just disconnected from the present moment. And it's a great way to come back to where you're at. So as we get started, I want to bring you back to that first spark of life. As our cells begin to divide and form a tiny beating heart and a fragile skeletal system and a central nervous system, the experience of being in relationship with another person and with the world around us, our environment, has a profound impact on who we are and who we will become. And although many of us can describe lots of memories with words, with pictures in our mind, memory, first and foremost, is a cellular function. Those memories are held and stored in our bodies. Even those that we can't recall, our body remembers. They stay stored in our bodies. And I want you to keep that in mind as we continue. So I'm going to talk to you today about the findings from the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study. We call it the ACES study. Just by a show of hands, how many of you have heard of the ACES study? Wonderful. That's great. It's exciting to see hands raised and more hands raised every time we go into a room. So that ACES study confirms with scientific evidence that adversity early on in life increases the risk for physical, mental, and behavioral challenges later on in life. It's the largest study of its kind with over 17,000 participants, and it was developed and co-sponsored by Kaiser Permanente in San Diego and the Center for Disease Control in Atlanta. And it was done in the early 90s. We've had this science for a long, long time. We've had this research for a long, long time, and yet half of this room hasn't heard of it. And we're excited that the other half has. So the two gentlemen you see on the screen here, Dr. Robert Onda and Dr. Vince Felitti, are the co-principal investigators of the ACE study. And Dr. Robert Onda designed the ACE study while he was at the CDC in Atlanta, working as a senior scientist. And I tell you that not only to give you an idea of where this information comes from, but also Dr. Onda, after getting this research and seeing the lack of movement that was happening, decided that what needed to happen was this information needed to get into the hands of each and every community member. And so along with some public health professionals in Washington State, he developed this curriculum that I'm gonna take you through today. So this is not just me doing research and putting together a presentation. This really comes from the co-principal investigator, Dr. Onda, who continues to advise us and mentor us as we get this information into the hands of folks. So we actually have a statewide cohort, South Dakota ACES and Resiliency cohort, that is made up of not only myself, but professionals and community members across the state who are also trained in this curriculum, so that we can continue to get this flowing through all of our communities, all of our professional networks, all of the sectors, so that we can make truly transformational change. So before I really get into the ACE study though, I want to talk a little bit about our nervous system, about our brain development. So our nervous system, you may recall, consists of our brain and our spinal cord, and it integrates all of our senses and information from receptors located throughout our body. Our nervous system really connects us. It connects us to ourselves, to our own experience. It connects us to other people. It connects us to the world around us. It regulates internal body functions. It manages elaborate chemical signalings. And it considers sensory input in the context of each and every second, almost instantaneously. And it determines our understanding of and our response to the world around us. Those cells in our nervous system are called neurons, and they are stunningly effective at processing and transmitting information. And they have a central purpose in doing so: to adapt in ways that keep us alive. That is their purpose, survival. Take information in, react accordingly so that we survive. Whatever it is, survival. So on the far left here, you see a set of brain cells, or neurons, and what they might look like at the time of birth. So we are born with all of the neurons that we'll have, but they're not yet connected to one another. And it's that connection that builds brain development. So this is what they look like at birth. You can see that there aren't very many connections there. Babies really are only born with the connections that they need to adapt and survive at that point in life. So most of the wiring of our brain occurs as a result of life experience through our senses. So by age 6, those same brain cells now have lots of different connections. This wiring of the brain, or the making of these complex neural networks, is experience dependent. So what gets experienced the most tends to lead to a more robust connection. And then eventually it begins to form networks. So this is a process called branching, or arborization, kind of like trees, right? And this is what we want to happen. We want kids to have a vast amount of experience, to experience the world in different ways, and to just sort of grow like a wild bush with lots of branches and leaves and sprouts all over. Now, the last section of this slide represents age 14, or about the time of puberty. And you notice that there are actually fewer connections here than there were earlier. This is because those least experienced connections, they actually tend to withdraw at about the time of puberty. So this is a process called pruning. Again, we can think about trees and gardening. So our brain recognizes that puberty is a really a time of shift, a time of transformation, and we're sort of shifting from childhood into beginning young adulthood. And our brain, in its incredible creation, recognizes that it's no longer about taking everything in, it's sort of about focusing in, figuring out who we are, who we want to be, what are we going to take with us. And so now our brain actually grows through pruning away those least used connections so that the ones that we're using most of the time have more room to grow. Same reason we trim and prune trees and bushes, right? We want those healthy connections to have room to grow. And that's a great thing, that makes sense. And this pruning happens throughout lives at different stages. But think about how this helps to explain why neglect or not getting the experiences that we need early on in life can have such a profound negative impact throughout life. If we're not getting experiences in those early years, we have less to prune from. And science is telling us that we may actually move into an excessive pruning because of that lack of experience. So early childhood matters for sure. And certainly every person's life is unique. We don't exist in a black and white world of good and bad. We all are sort of in a gray somewhere, right? But for illustration purposes, let's imagine two worlds. Let's imagine one world that is mean and dangerous and unsafe, and a second world that is kind and generous. Traumatic experiences during development, things like abuse, neglect, chaotic relationships, that generates very predictable patterns of brain architecture, behavior, and traits. So you may know that humans are really only made to be under stress for about 20 minutes at a time. We're still sort of operating off of our caveman stress response system of, if you meet a bear in the woods, you have to either ramp up to fight that bear, or run away, get the heck out of there, or stay very, very still and hope they don't notice you. But for 20 minutes at a time. The expectation is that that danger will pass. You'll either run away, fight your way out, or hold still and they'll leave. We are not built to go home to the bear. We are not built to go to work with the bear. So when we are in environments or have experiences that cause our stress chemicals to be continuously produced and flowing through our body, again, things like child abuse, neglect, even living in a really chaotic or dangerous environment or neighborhood, that has a big impact on our development. Under those circumstances, our bodies tend to prepare for life in a dangerous world. Our brain is a predicting brain, so it begins to assume that this experience will continue. So we've got to be ready for this all the time. And those stress hormones like cortisol exert influence on our cells, our chemicals, our wiring inside, and they sculpt brains that are wired for certain characteristics, things like being edgy, excuse me, hypervigilant, hot-tempered or impulsive, or maybe being withdrawn, disassociated, numb. If we're in an experience for a long time and we realize that we can't actually fight our way out and we can't run away, again, our predicting brain says the best thing to do is withdraw. So we may be withdrawn, disassociated. So this is really the path you see outlined on the top of this slide. For example, people who have traumatic stress from conception to the toddler years are likely going to have a higher baseline of cortisol. A normal functioning level of cortisol is going to be higher at all times. As a result, those folks may have a short fuse. They may be more self-focused. They may have a difficult time shifting from problem solving, or from emotion to problem solving. And think about that. If there is danger just around every corner, if this is their reality, then being focused out on others, thinking through the pros and cons of a decision, that doesn't contribute to survival. That readiness, that always-on readiness, does contribute to survival. Now, the downside to this is that when those stress hormones like cortisol are continually produced and flowing through our brain and bodies, they're actually toxic to our brain cells. So they can inhibit those strong connections from forming. They can even cause brain cells to die. So this is why we call things like continuous stress or trauma or chaotic, unpredictable stress. We refer to that all under the umbrella of toxic stress. Now, the lower path in this diagram we refer to as the benevolent world path. This world is kind, it's easygoing, It's helpful, free from traumatic stress. The adults in this world show up and provide safety and comfort. And people growing up on this path are more likely to develop a brain with cells and wiring and chemistry for being focused and flexible and relationship oriented. Now I want to be sure that you recognize here that, again, we're not talking about good and bad, right and wrong. Regardless of the path, our brain and our body adapts appropriately. It does what it's supposed to do so that we survive. It's not adaptive and maladaptive, it's all adaptive. It's all for survival, and it's all necessary. And as a species, this is good. So having adaptations like hypervigilance and quick to act, those adaptations come in really handy in certain situations and even certain careers. You can think about an experience or a situation where it might be helpful for someone to be quick to act, a little bit emotionally disconnected, hypervigilant, able to see and spot danger quickly. Certainly our first responders use those characteristics. Working in a trauma ER, you know, if you come in with a limb hanging off, you don't want a surgeon who's going to empathize with you in that moment, right? You don't need someone to really feel your feelings with you in that moment. You want somebody who is quick to act, who kind of sees you as a job to be done, and doesn't get caught up in the emotion of the humanness of it. Now at other times, you know, after surgery, we might want that empathy. But we can see in certain situations it's helpful. In certain situations it's good. And as a society, it makes sense and it behooves us to welcome all different adaptations. Because those of us who have grown up in a path similar to this top path are well prepared to lead in times of trauma and stress and chaos. And those of us that come from a path that maybe looks more like the bottom path may be more well equipped to lead in times of peace and tranquility. But if I'm putting a team together, I want a team who has life experience from all ends of the spectrum. Because that's going to give me the best perspective, the widest perspective. So it's good for us as a species. Now, it's when our biology collides with social expectations that we run into trouble. So if you put a person from that benevolent world path into the chaotic and turbulent environment of, say, a war zone, they're likely going to struggle, right? If you take a kid from small town, rural South Dakota, and they join the military at 18, do we just ship them overseas to a war zone and say good luck? No. They go through very specific training because we recognize that their experience, their environment up to this point likely has not prepared them to survive and thrive in a war zone, a very different environment. We get that fundamentally, right? The thing is, it works the other way around too. So a child who has adapted to a dangerous and stressful world, they may not sustain patience. They may not share or cooperate or use words as a first choice. And when that child comes to school or an after-school care program for the first time, and we ask them to share, cooperate, have patience, there can be a really painful disconnect there that is hard for everyone. That child, too, will need to be actively taught the skills required to succeed in this context, just as we would train a person from safety to go into chaos and danger. And I would argue that it's not just children. Even as adults, if all we've known is something like that top line of the last slide, we are not going to automatically recognize a safe environment as safe. It's just going to feel different. We have to be willing to teach skills for new environments. So, traumatic experience and chronic adversity affect the development of our nervous system in at least 4 ways. Now, if I had all day, we could really dive into these topics, which I would love to do, but they only gave me an hour. So I'm not gonna be able to dive deep into these, but know that this information is out there. I hope I'll give you enough today that just sparks an interest and a desire to know more and to seek this information out. And then we can talk afterwards and I can give you, a list of resources. But I want to tell you a little bit about these 4 ways to help understand these long-term outcomes. So the first is that patterns in communication among and between neurons build up those pathways in our brain that over time become sort of our automatic go-to biological responses to experience. So this is kind of what we showed in the 3 columns, right? But that continues. And when those get really strong, really thick, when the electrical chemical signalings have gone through that path over and over, when we've experienced something over and over and over, it becomes a go-to response. We don't have to really think about it anymore. It becomes more of a reaction than a response. So for example, you can think about learning to tie your shoe. When you were a child, you had to learn to tie your shoe, and it was hard. You had to actually kind of take it down step by step and really think through it. You had to try. I would venture to guess that not many of us actually think about tying our shoes, right? It's pretty automatic. You start the process and you don't need your brain to actively think about what's the next step here. And this is what happens in all kinds of ways. But this becomes our responses. And our nervous system develops so that many of these neural pathways begin to emerge as a dense network of interconnected cells. And that helps us, again, to respond very quickly to ourselves and to the world around us in a way that doesn't actually require active thinking. It's more in our automatic responses. So neuroscientists call this network the connectome. And this helps us to understand those quick responses. We often talk about this now as triggers. We also call this emotional memories. So what this means is that sometimes just the smell of something can kick you right back into a memory. But maybe it's not a memory that you have with words and pictures, but it's a memory that is stored in your body. So understanding this response can help us to understand our behavior, our sort of big reactions that maybe don't make sense to people around us. The second way is that patterns in brain activity during sensitive developmental periods shape how each brain region functions, including how it supports specific functions like co-regulation with other people, with our sensory processing, and with problem solving. So our brain, as I said, we're not born with a fully developed brain. Throughout our lives, our early lives, up until about mid to late 20s, we have different sensitive developmental periods where different parts of our brain and different functions of our brain are really being developed in that moment. And because of that, they are the most vulnerable and susceptible to experiences, positive and negative. Understanding that helps us to understand not only the adaptations that we can expect to have from adverse experiences, but it also helps us to understand what positive experiences that we can be really intentional about making sure that all kids have access to in ways that can actually remediate earlier periods of toxic stress or trauma. So knowing the right kinds of experiences to avoid and the right kinds of experiences to provide helps us to grow brains that are really well adapted and built. So again, if we had more time, this curriculum can actually go through all of those sensitive developmental periods from right at conception through to early adulthood, and really talk about what's going on at each of those times. How do we expect that adaptation to show up? Because what's great about the science around this is we know enough now to recognize that a lot of these adaptations or the impact of trauma is quite predictable. There are different different factors that matter, like the age at the time of maltreatment, the gender of the individual, the type of maltreatment that they experience. But we know a lot about the brain and its development that we can begin to assume or predict what types of adaptations and outcomes we'll see based on those three factors. So the other two things listed here really go into how experience can get under our skin and actually be transmitted from generation to generation. So how it impacts our DNA and our genetic code. So the first way is that chromosomes contain our human DNA, and that's where our genetic code is laid out. So this code is really the instruction manual for cell functioning. Chromosomes package the DNA in ways that really protect that genetic code, so as we grow, as our cells divide, the instructions are copied over correctly, and cells know what to do with those instructions. Experience can either strengthen or erode the protection of that instruction manual. So on our chromosomes, we have what's called telomeres. And the telomeres are kind of like that end cap, that plastic end cap on the end of our shoelaces. And it has a very specific function of keeping that DNA tightly woven and protected. Aging is the natural process of the wearing away of our telomeres. But we understand now that adversity in childhood can actually prematurely wear away those telomeres and damage the instruction codes for our cells. Now the good news here is that we also realize and recognize that by providing positive childhood experiences and protection from adversity, we can actually heal. Our telomeres can heal in childhood. So when we know what to do, how to do it, when to do it, we can actually provide protection and heal those telomeres and help heal from past traumatic experiences. And then finally, recognizing that ancestral experience can alter how our genes are used by cells. So this isn't about changing our DNA, but it's about chemical attachments to our DNA. So we call this epigenetics. So the experience of our ancestors can generate genetic warnings in the form of chemicals that attach to our DNA, and those attachments cause cells to read our DNA differently. And changes to the way that cells read and interpret this code in the set of instructions can protect the species from danger and promote health-promoting behaviors, but they can also contribute to some of the health and social issues that are sometimes passed between generations. And again, that's a big topic. We could probably talk all day just on that and really diving in and understanding that generational transmission. So again, I hope that you will really see the value in diving deeper into some of this information and seeking out the information, because it really is the foundation for what Dean Fulton talked about and what Chief Justice talked about of really coming to this work with empathy, with compassion, being able to, as much as possible, step into someone else's shoes and begin to comprehend the experience of their own lives and of that of their ancestors, so that we can better understand what we see in front of us. So I want to talk just a little bit more about brain development and hopefully give you kind of a quick and easy tool, not only for yourself to understand how our brains work in a very simple term, but also to maybe share that with your clients, with people that you're working with, so that we can all have a better understanding what's happening in our body when we have some big responses and reactions to things that are happening in our environment. So we can use our hand as a tool to explain the brain. I would invite you to do this with me and practice it. But our brain is built from the bottom up, from the back to the front, and from the inside out. So that brain development is sequential. If you think of your hand and make a fist with the thumb on the inside, that represents our brain. So our brain stem is what we're born with, really fully functioning. The brainstem is responsible for those automatic body functions, our breathing, our heart rate, our internal temperature control, connecting with a caregiver, all that's in our brainstem. That's the part of the brain that is really like directing our body into what each of those organs need to do. As our brain grows then, we begin to grow our limbic system. This is beginning to form in utero and is really growing strongly in those first 3 years of life. So our limbic system is kind of our emotional processing center in simplistic terms. I like to actually think of this as if our brainstem is like our survival brain, it's our reptilian brain. So you think about the brain functions that reptiles have, that's kind of what exists in our brainstem, just survival. Then our limbic system is our emotional brain. It's our mammalian brain. So we can think about what we see in the animal kingdom, right? The ability to connect, the ability to feel lives here. This is where we really start to connect with caregivers. So if our reptilian brain is concerned with, can I survive? Am I safe? Our mammalian brain is concerned about, am I loved? Do I belong? Am I cared for? And this is the part of our brain that really reacts, that where our big emotions live, like fear, panic. It reacts to danger and delight and directs the body to act accordingly in response. And then if we bring our fingers folded over on the front, this is our neocortex. This is our thinking brain, our human brain. Am I safe? Am I loved? Am I cared for? What can I learn from this? How can I do better going forward? How can I do differently going forward? This is our thinking brain. This is the part of our brain that we need to talk to when we're teaching someone something new. When we are taking goal-directed action. This is where our prefrontal cortex is, where our executive functioning lives. And our executive functioning are, again, things like our complex thinking, analysis, judgment, thinking long-term, right? Like what could happen next? Taking that goal-directed action. So understanding where we want to be and figuring out what are the steps I have to take to get there. All of that is in our cortex, in our thinking brain. Now what happens when we get sort of emotionally hijacked, when we have an experience of danger that kicks us into survival mode, we refer to that as flipping our lid. And when that happens, this guy's in charge, not this guy. So you can probably think of a time when you've maybe had a big reaction, and later on when you were able to calm down and center yourself, you look back at your behavior and think, ooh, that is not me. I can't believe I reacted that way. I think we've all had that experience, right? But in that mind, you didn't have access to that full prefrontal cortex because limbic system was in charge. And that's its purpose. It is to use those experiences, those past experiences of danger and delight, and determine if what's happening now is something that we've experienced before. And if it's familiar, we sort of kick into our reactionary mode. And that may look like big responses, big reactions. So when we know that that's how our brain works, we can recognize that if we want to reach somebody's thinking brain, then we have to go through those two lower brains first. So before we can reason with someone, we first have to regulate that person. We have to help them regulate so that they feel safe. And that means that we have to be regulated, right? If you have kids, you know that you can't calm down a kid by freaking out, right? You calm down a child by being calm, by letting them borrow your calmness, your regulation. So we start by regulating. Make sure that you're regulated and that that person feels safe. And then we move to connection. So we regulate and then we relate. We remind that person in front of us that we're having this conversation because I'm here with you, because because I care about you. Because we're in this together. So we help them get that sense of belonging and connectedness. Only then will our thinking brain come back online, so that we can start talking about reason. We can start talking about goal-directed steps. Only then. You can have that conversation when someone's in their limbic brain, but you can also have a conversation with this wall here, and the memory of that conversation is the same. So I know when I'm talking to my 16-year-old daughter, and I see the signs in her face, in her eyes, in her nonverbals that say she's in panic mode and she's not actually feeling very safe with me right now, I know that I have to stop having the conversation that I'm having, and I have to instead focus on calming and connecting. Once I've done that, we can revisit the conversation about consequences or what happens next. Only after we've calmed and connected. So throughout our bodies, throughout our childhoods, we continue to have these sensitive developmental periods that give us our full brain. And throughout that time, there is a continuous sort of dance of experience and adaptation that generates age-appropriate capacities for things like feeling and thinking and responding to the world around us. New abilities build on the growth and development from earlier sensitive periods. And over time, we have an elaborate system of these specialized brain regions that develop to help us navigate increasingly complex environments. So by the time we reach our mid to late 20s, our sort of go-to stress response system is pretty well built. Now it's always changeable. Our brain has what's called plasticity, which means that we can always create new connections and form new sort of go-to responses through practice and repetition. But that reaction to our world around us is pretty well built by the time we're in our mid to late 20s. And we often refer to this as our window of tolerance. So our window of tolerance is kind of how much can we take and still keep processing new information from the environment before we reach that point of overwhelm where we flip our lid. So our goal then is to recognize what that overwhelm looks like in ourselves and other people, so that we can begin to recognize when we're getting to the top of our window of tolerance or when we're outside of our window of tolerance. That's our indicator that we need to refocus on coming back to window of tolerance, coming back to regulation. When we get people back to their window of tolerance as quickly as possible, we can reduce the long-term impacts of stress response, of an overly active stress response. So it may look like hyperarousal, which is sort of an active arousal, fight or flight, so we're moving towards the conflict or we're running away from the conflict, but it's active. That can look a lot of different ways. We can also move into a hypoarousal, which is a parasympathetic response. It's an immobilization. It doesn't always look like freeze in terms of physical freeze. It may be a mental freeze. It may be really not being able to access or move through thoughts. Numbness, emptiness, paralysis, all of that can be a hypoarousal. But when we recognize that someone or ourselves is outside of the window of tolerance, then we need to focus on what helps in that moment, what helps to return to the window of tolerance so that we can continue to have access to our full human thinking brain. So we talked a little bit about sensitive developmental periods where toxic stress and experience has profound effects on human development. But those times are also windows of opportunity, because the developing brain is sensitive to all experience, positive and negative. By paying attention to those developmental periods, we can do a better job of protecting children and providing the kinds of challenges and interactions and support that may actually remediate those earlier periods of toxic stress and promote lifelong health and well-being. So we have a collective choice. We can actively develop skills and accommodations that enable everyone to contribute to community, or we can continue our societal patterns of rejecting people when they have normal adaptive responses to childhood adversity. If you remember just one thing from this section on brain development, I hope it will be that toxic stress can be hardwired into biology. And before we assume that the behaviors are a rebellious choice, let's think about the possibility that adversity may be at the heart of the challenges we see. So I'm going to move quickly into giving you some data from the ACE study to talk about the long-term impacts of this. So we talked about the impact of stress on individuals. Now we're going to kind of zoom out and take a 10,000-foot view of this and look at what this means for our communities. How does this show up on an epidemiological level? And so this is where the ACE study comes in. So this is the ACE pyramid, which was the basis for the ACE study and the hypothesis of what they would find. So the ACE pyramid is a life course model from preconception to early death that is designed to understand how adversity in childhood influences human development in very predictable ways. And this is good news, because what's predictable is preventable. So these are the 10 ACEs that were studied in the original ACE study in the 90s. It was 10 indicators of household dysfunction, including growing up with a substance abusing parent, parental separation or divorce, having a caregiver or household member that was mentally ill, witnessing intimate partner violence, and criminal behavior as evidenced by having a household member imprisoned. They looked at 2 forms of neglect, emotional and physical, and 3 forms of abuse, emotional, physical, and sexual. And you can see from the percentages on this slide that ACEs are quite common, even in this population, which the original population was members of the Kaiser Health Permanente Managed Care Consortium. So they were primarily middle-aged, white, pretty well-off folks. They had access to some of the best healthcare in the world. And so even in that population, ACEs are common. They were also highly interrelated. So where there's one, 87% of the time, at least one of those other 9 ACEs was also present. And so this really called for a different way of looking at how childhood experiences impacts individuals, instead of looking at them one by one, to really look at the collective impact of that. And so here you can see how emotional, physical, and sexual abuse are each highly related to being exposed to intimate partner violence. So in the first cluster of bars here, you see the height of the bars is the percent of people who had experienced emotional abuse. As the frequency of witnessing intimate partner violence increases from never to once or twice to sometimes, often, and very often, that risk of emotional abuse increases dramatically. And the same pattern is seen for physical abuse in the middle set of bars and sexual abuse in the last set of bars. So what this means is that where there is domestic violence, the risk of childhood abuse increases dramatically. And this should give us some insight into how we address these problems in our community. So this is why they developed the ACE score, seeing this overlap between issues. So the ACE score is simply a count of the number of ACEs or categories of ACEs each person experienced from 0 to 10. And it's a measure of the childhood biologic stress dose. So as that ACE score goes up, on average, the exposure to developmental effects of toxic stress increases. And so what we see in the data is this dose-response relationship between ACEs and outcomes. So where there's a higher dose of adverse childhood experiences, the higher the percent of people with health problems. Now I want to remind you that we're talking about population health. So an ACE score is not an individual indicator of health outcomes or behavior outcomes. It is a measure for an epidemiological study, or how it looks for a group of people. So all of the data slides from the ACE study are formatted in the same way. Along the bottom are ACE scores, from 0 on the left to 4 or more on the right, and then the vertical axis is the percent of people who have the disease or condition that we're talking about. So here in the first set of bars, you can see the percent of people who became regular cigarette smokers by age 12 goes up as the level of ACE score goes up. In the second set, we see those who were smokers as adults also go up in that stepwise fashion. And then finally, in the third set, people with higher ACE scores have an increased risk of chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, or COPD. So almost twice the rate from 0 to 4 or more. So ACEs lead to early onset of smoking, which is sustained through adulthood, and eventually leads to a high risk of smoking-related lung disease. Probably not a surprise, right? If we start early, if we keep it up, it makes sense that we have a higher risk of getting that smoking-related lung disease. But the ACE study is the first study that really looked at the combination of factors and how this progressed. So here we can see and begin to anticipate why ACEs are related to certain behaviors and social conditions. So here we see the risk of struggling with alcoholism increases 6-fold from an ACE score of 0 to a score of 6. And ACEs affect relationships. So people with higher ACE scores are more likely to marry someone who suffers from alcoholism. And think for a minute about how these indicate then how ACEs tend to be transmitted from one generation to the next. For injected drug use, the risk increases dramatically from an ACE score of 0 to 4 or more. The risk of injected drug use is 40 times higher for an ACE score of 4 compared to ACE scores of 0. 40 times. So consider for a moment, why would 12-year-olds be more likely to smoke as their ACE score goes up? Imagine what it feels like to be a 12-year-old with a high ACE score, dealing with 3 or 4 or 6 of those items from the list of 10. Imagine what that feels like in the body. And now imagine what access to resources that you have, or other healthier coping strategies. What do you see in your environment? What do you have access to? What information do you have access to about what's happening in your body? When we understand that ACEs are held in the body, that shows up in our body functioning, and then take into account that ACEs can lead to a higher likelihood of feeling depressed, anxious, difficulty concentrating. And then think about the impact of nicotine, which is pretty efficiently delivered through cigarette smoke. It can actually reduce anxiety and feelings of depression. It can improve concentration. So is it any wonder that kids with higher ACE scores are more likely to become regular cigarette smokers? Is it any wonder that they may seek out drugs or alcohol or other substances that cope with the feelings and circumstances that are consequences of higher and higher ACE exposure? So it's this concept of adaptive behaviors, even those with known negative consequences in the face of the effect of ACEs, that really leads us to the idea of trauma-informed care. This idea changes the question from what's wrong with you to what happened to you. So I'm sure you can all imagine someone in your life that has maybe made some mistakes, had behaviors that maybe you don't understand. And you may have had a moment, a thought, where in your head, or maybe even out loud, you said, "What is wrong with you? Like, you've got all the information to make a better decision here. What is wrong with you?" Now call that person to mind and change that question to what happened to you. What happened? How is it impacting you? It's this shift this way of thinking about and addressing individuals with problems that are related to ACEs that reduces blame and shame and leads to a more compassionate and kind and empathetic response and interaction. So there were over 40 different health and social problems documented by ACE study publications. And because of this, it really leads us to conclude that ACEs are the leading cause of health and social problems in our nation. And this should get us thinking about prevention. And I want to be clear that this goes beyond households. So beyond adverse childhood experiences, we can also have adverse community environments. This is not just about parents. This is not just about what's happening in the household, because what happens in communities impacts what happens in households. If you're a parent, I would invite you to think about your worst day as a parent. It likely is connected to something within our social structure, within our environment, and not just a defect in you that day. How we parent in our household is impacted by what we face in the community, by our access to resources, our access to belonging and having concrete help. So communities matter, which means that our systems need to build partnerships with community groups and work across sectors to support efforts to increase access to needed services and supports. So how do we put this together and make a case for understanding ACEs as a powerful pathway to leading to health and well-being? When we understand that ACEs are common and have this strong cumulative impact, preventing ACEs and that intergenerational transmission is really the greatest opportunity for improving the well-being of human populations. So this slide shows the percent of various health and social problems that epidemiologists estimate are caused by ACEs. So what you see in the middle, the oil slick, we refer to it as the oil slick slide. So it's kind of like an oil spot in the middle. The percent of the problem that is coded by the oil spill represents the percent of each problem that epidemiologists estimate are caused by ACEs. And that is then the percent of the problem that is potentially preventable by preventing ACEs. These are huge numbers. We rarely see numbers this high in public health studies. 78% of IV drug use, 45% of drunk driving, 61% of incarceration. So it's the cumulative effect of ACEs that reflects a powerful opportunity for prevention. This is where I get excited, because it doesn't matter where we're working or where our passion lies. When we understand this information and we make it a point to intentionally think about infusing this information into the work that we do, it doesn't matter if we're working to reduce cancer rates or reduce incarceration or reduce and eliminate child abuse and neglect or intimate partner violence. When we align a portion of our work around this common goal of preventing the accumulation of ACEs and moderating their effects for the adults in our communities, we can reduce all of these problems and many others all at once. These don't have to be competing issues. So imagine the powerful prevention strategies that we could employ if we used data-driven results and made data-driven decision-making. When we can see this cascade of factors that shape life course. If children are not safe at home, and they're not safe or welcome at school because of their biological adaptations to trauma, can we really be surprised when they come knocking at the door of our court system? Where else are they gonna go? So with this picture in mind, school personnel and neighborhood residents can understand their juvenile crime prevention roles very differently. A group in Washington State used this to have a very different conversation around juvenile justice measures. So the adults there now hold themselves accountable to intentionally and systematically generating safe and welcoming social and academic environments that don't exclude children who have experienced traumas. And that approach led to changes in the county juvenile justice system and reduced recidivism among youth served by the court, because this information was intentionally being taught throughout the community. So they were providing community-based education about ACES to judges, probation officers, prosecutors, attorneys, and the general public about this information, so that everyone could come to the table and recognize their role in the prevention conversation. So I want to just quickly touch on resilience. And the reason this is important is because we have to recognize that, again, our brain remains plastic. We always have the ability to create new connections and to create new go-to responses. We know that there are people who, despite lots of early childhood adversity, have gone on to be really well-adjusted and impactful community members, and maybe even more impactful in the work that they do because of that experience that they've had. And so what do we know about resilience? We know that there are 3 core protective systems, and when those systems are nested, we have the best outcomes for people, even if they have early life adversity. So those 3 systems are individual capabilities, belonging with caring and competent adults, and then community resilience. So people do best when they're in thriving families, in thriving communities. And then we recognize that we can all do our part to help one another sort of build up those individual capabilities that help us weather life's storm. Things like positive view, which is closely related to hope and is just the story we tell ourselves, that good things can happen to us. Self-efficacy, which says we have a measure of control in our life. I have some choice, I have some voice, I have some measure of control here. Self-regulation, our ability to gauge our state of mind and emotions and keep those under control in a social situation. All of these are also things that often do not develop well when we are experiencing toxic stress. These are skills. They're not something we have or don't have. They're skills that can be taught. When we make a point to intentionally use opportunities to increase skills in how we think about ourselves, how we recognize where we have control, how we regulate in a difficult situation, all of that helps to build those individual capabilities. But we can't just rely on people to do it for themselves. They're skills that must be taught. We can nurture belonging. Relationships with caring and competent individuals are vital contributors to resilience and recovery, but the competency part is important. It's not enough to just care. We have to have our own competencies so that we can stay calm, especially when we're working with people who are hardwired for survival in dangerous or unpredictable worlds. People who have difficulty with family bonds and picking up social cues and emotional regulation. All of those consequences of developmental trauma can make for challenging friends, neighbors, and clients. So we have to do the work to make sure that we have the competency to stay calm in those situations and be part of being helpful. And then finally, fostering thriving communities. And this is really about empowerment. And there's a lot of ways to do this, coming together around issues that matter. But most importantly, I think leaning into the people who have the most at stake so that they can be leaders in their own community's change. It's recognizing the impact of peers with lived experience. It's lifting up people with lived experience to be part of leadership and solution building, because that experience matters. And we don't have to fix it all at once. We can focus on the window of opportunity. As a whole, society is built on sort of an eject-reject system, where we often remove people from that belonging and nurturing when they have biological adaptations to trauma and stress. if we change that to look for ways to restore that connection, that belonging, look for ways to allow folks to have a voice in their outcomes, to have some leadership in solving the issues that they're most affected by. We are, as humans, wired for connection. We'll find it. We'll either find it, with people that build us up and give us a chance to positively impact community, or we will find it in the people who have a lot of the same developmental responses to trauma that we exhibit. Because that's a place where we're not gonna feel shame and judgment. We will search for belonging. When we continue the societal pattern of rejecting and ejecting and isolating people who are most affected by ACEs, it is hurting too many people and fueling a cycle of adversity that we can interrupt. We have the information and the ability to interrupt. We can decide that every interaction matters, that everyone has value because of their lived experience. We can choose to focus on building resilience instead of rejection. There's a predictable pattern to transformative change, and it begins with discovering communication, which leads people to clarify their values and thinking. With new knowledge and new habits of thinking, people change the action that they take in everyday life. And the collective actions of many shape a new reality long before new laws are passed. So change is up to us. It's shaped by our thoughts, by our conversations, the ways that we relate to one another in our families, in our workplaces, in relationships, in communities. And as we work to prevent the accumulation of ACEs, let's keep in mind that it's not about getting to ACE scores of 0. Bringing scores down any amount will have a huge impact. We may not be able to prevent that first ACE from occurring in a family or for an individual, but certainly we can recognize and notice when children likely have 5 and make sure that that number doesn't get to 10. As we thread through all of our work, a new focus of supporting adults, particularly adults who, through no fault of their own, experienced many ACEs when they were children, we will prevent ACEs for the next generation. So we live at a time of great hope and promise. The largest public health discovery of our time, perhaps of all time, is about family. It's about community. It's about children. And it's about all of us. And our actions to prevent ACEs, whether large or small, can profoundly improve the future for generations to come. Thank you so much for being here, and I really look forward to hearing from Olga and Carrie the rest of the day about some more specifics of what this looks like in the court system. Thank you. So it sounds like we have a little time. This never happens for me. We have a little time for questions. So if you have questions, I'd love to hear them. Or thoughts or insights as well.
Since I'm close, when you think about ACEs and how it interweaves through all those systems and all your experience with it, is there a part of our system, whether it's education or justice or social service, that you really, in your experience and exposure, really sense like the greatest need, or like where you would like to see the most traction of this education, like increase in awareness throughout all of the systems? Is there one that you're most eager about seeing the change?
That's a great question. And I want to go back to this because it really is important that it's flowing through all of our systems, and that no one system or one person feels like they have to do it all, or like it's all on their shoulders. I think it really is necessary for all of the systems, but I think two things. I think medical, and I think in our court systems, for sure, because that's where we have access to kids and families, and especially access to kids and families who are going through tough things right now. So when I think about the court system, and not just the criminal legal system, but the civil legal system, right? This isn't necessarily just kids and families who where a crime has taken place. This is our civil judicial system. This is where families have to go when they're going through divorce and separation. It may not involve a criminal legal case, but it still involves a courtroom sometimes and sitting in front of a judge, and that can be extremely intimidating and traumatic. And so when, in all of our systems, we recognize the ability to wrap around that whole family, not just the kids, not just the victim, if you will, but that whole family, I think that's when we can best support the trajectory of those kids and adults moving forward, and how they really then continue to engage in community in positive ways. Thank you. Any other questions?
The request is for a copy of your PowerPoint, first of all.
Yes, that will come.
Awesome, thank you. I'm Roxy Erickson. I prosecute juvenile cases and abuse and neglect for Pennington County. And having done that for over 20 years, what struck me the most about your presentation is when a child's unwelcome at home and then unwelcome at school, and then by second grade they're expelled for the first time, and our educational system's response across the state is to send it to the prosecutor's office and say, charge this kid for truancy. If you don't charge the kid for truancy, how about you charge the parent for failure to send your child to school? Do you know how many kids go to school when the court has ordered a youth to go to school? 0. It's not solving the problem. So when you talk about a system that needs to be corrected, and you look at the juvenile justice system overall as a whole, the majority of the kids coming into court are for chins offenses. They're for status offenses. It's for maybe tobacco, mostly truancy. And we're not talking about kids who are not getting an education, so obviously the school's concerned about that. But you're also looking at the whole picture, the community response, the idea that somehow by placing a youth on probation at the age of 10 for failing to go to school is somehow going to solve the problem, and then send this kid to school, and all of a sudden he's going to get a high school education and then go on to college, which, you know, it's unrealistic, and it certainly is not the solution to the problem. And so your question was awesome, because I do agree with you. Where does it start and who needs to hear this? Our education system needs to change, and the court's response to truancy isn't effective. So I mean, really, it's just thank you for what you've done today. I appreciate it.
No, my pleasure. And again, this is part of a statewide movement to get this information in the hands of every single person. So we're doing a lot with schools. But there's sort of this, like, what we're doing here, this like grassroots movement to get information in the hands of everybody, of people, is really sort of a bottom-up strategy. We partner very closely with CPCM to work at a systems level, right? Is sort of a bottom-down or top-down approach. And eventually we need to reach a tipping point where this information is just flowing through our communities. And like I said, that's what changes policy. That's what changes how we actually organize our systems. And that's transformational and it takes time, but each one of us can change today. I mean, when we walk out the door, our interactions can change. And we can keep striving to be the example to make sure that that change continues to move up the line while we continue to work on systems change from the top down. But thank you for being here and for sharing that. And if there is an audience or a group that you would like to have this information, please do reach out. This information is free. There's no barrier to it. We are here to share this loud and widely and with anybody who will listen. Any other questions or thoughts?
Always willing to add more value. where I can. I really appreciate, and I know you didn't have the time to cover it, I'm very familiar with the information. It's completely transformed my own life. You know, having 6 ACEs as a youth and now having my brain expanded to see ACEs in addition to it as adverse community experiences. You know, I recognize it as the beyond ACEs research, but I never saw it until today, spelled out as ACEs again. And that would skyrocket my number from 6 to I don't know yet, because seeing it in that way is very new to me. But I am a testament to the resilience. And when you start to speak to how I've been able to arrive at 37, providing support to ACEs and justice impacted youth and adults, it doesn't happen without those systems you outlined and resilience. From how I speak to myself and the mindset of good things can happen to me, the affirmation I receive around me daily, and how I strategically choose that association so that they speak life over me, and attachment and belonging, mentorship. It's completely transformed the last 7 years of my life. And then you speak to community and culture as well. And I'm deeply spiritual, believe in community, and get to use my story to connect to others who've had those same experiences. And I just want to thank you for continuing to do the work that you do, and invite you to speak to more to the impact of resilience and the importance of it, because again, I am not here without my resilience in leading the nonprofit I started 3 years ago, doing the work to directly support ACEs impacted youth, adults, and their families.
Resilience is such a big conversation, and it's an exciting one to have, because we can all connect. I mean, we can all think about a time that we've struggled, and those struggles are on a whole spectrum, right? But what got us through, what helped us, usually it's the people around us. We can probably all think about how our life trajectory has gone and point back to someone who said something impactful to us, who gave us that positive view that said, boy, I really see you doing this, or you are really skilled in this. And maybe we didn't see it for ourselves or believe it for ourselves. Like me up at this podium is a great example. 3 years ago, I would never have described myself as a public speaker, ever. I would never have wanted to be behind a podium in front of people. But when you have something that you are passionate about, and when you have somebody who says, you could do this, even as an adult, that makes a huge difference in your life. I think about, Terry, your lived experience and the way that you act as a peer mentor. So Terry and I have worked together in this ACES space for quite some time. And we've had the pleasure of getting to go into the Juvenile Diversion Center the Juvenile Detention Center in Minnehaha County. And who do you think those kids connect with more? Me, who's like, let me tell you about science and data. Or Terry, who's like, let me tell you about my life and how similar it is to yours. And let me tell you what I'm doing now. Let me tell you what helped me. Now, I like to think that I was still an important part of that conversation.
Yes, 100%.
Because data matters and science matters. But those kids listened to Terry. And simply Terry saying, I've been where you are now, and look what I'm doing now. I have my own company. I'm a public educator. I started a nonprofit. I graduated college. I have my master's degree. simply by him saying that as a peer, as somebody who has walked through their steps, it's automatic hope. It's automatic possibility in a way that is much different than me telling them there's possibility. With like, trust me, I've done the research. His life story makes way more difference than my data and science can make. When we're talking about helping people who are going through it, it's the power of the peer. It's leading into people who have lived that experience, who understand and can share what has helped them, and building that connection, building that belonging, and giving them that hope. But it really, for us as professionals, I just really want to encourage you to take this information and go inward with it. So we hear this all the time when we do this information. It's like, what do I do? Give me the thing. Like, where's the easy button? What's the strategy? What do I do? There isn't a checklist. There isn't a roadmap. There isn't a thing that you do other than you let this change your heart. And part of that work is often going back into our own childhood. Because even if we don't maybe identify ourselves as that top path on the slide, we still experience hurts and harms, and that experience impacts our adult functioning. And when we do the work to go back and say, you know, what are my beliefs because of that? What are my triggers because of that? And do the work to really expand this internally first, that's what changes the way that you are able to empathize, that you are able to have compassion, that you are able to put yourselves in the shoes of someone else. Brene Brown has this great little video on empathy where she talks about that, like, empathy is so hard because it requires vulnerability. To really be empathetic with a person, to really put yourself in someone else's shoes, you have to go to a place that is as similar as you can find in your own experience. So if I want to be empathetic to somebody who is feeling alone and isolated, I have to connect with a place in my history where I felt alone and isolated. And that's vulnerable. That's hard. It's a whole lot easier to say, let me fix that. Empathy requires sitting in it, joining them in it, and feeling it with them. And that's hard work. And that's the internal work that I think makes just a huge shift in how we connect with those around us. So I'll end there, or I'll just keep talking all day. Thank you for those questions.
Thank you again, Cassie, for being here. We really appreciate your presentation and the information you gave. At this time, we're going to take a short break, 12 minutes.